All right, everybody. We will go ahead and get started just to make sure that we are honoring that time we have together today. It's going to be a quick hour. We're going to move quickly, and hopefully you'll walk away with some practical strategies that you can implement right away. So this is the elementary webinar for figurative language in AOR 1.2. So hopefully you are here for that. Before we get started, just to go over a little housekeeping, we do ask that if you have any artificial intelligence note trackers, if you will please turn those off. We ask that you not use those while we are in the meeting. We do record the webinar and it will be available for you to rewatch if you need to later. But any of the AI note trackers, we will ask to leave the chat. I do want to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Brenna McCormick, and I'm at the Office of Assessment and Standards at the State Department. I am kind of serving two roles. I'm the curriculum-based professional learning team lead, but I also serve on the ELA Standards and Assessment team, where my primary role is middle level ELA, but I'm filling in right now for our elementary ELA as well because that is my background. So I am excited to be here with you. I have with me Casey Prince Harvey, who is our secondary support for ELA standards, and she's going to be running the behind the scenes for me today. So if you have any questions or need any links or resources, pop that in the chat and Casey will be glad to respond to those for you. You do have a note catcher. I'm going to put that in the chat now, and Casey will link it periodically throughout our presentation. If you want to open that up, it'll have notes to kind of follow along with our presentation today, as well as links to resources. And finally, we are offering recertification credit for our webinars. So in order to receive your recertification credit, you want to make sure that you attend live and you are participating actively. Remain in attendance for the duration of the webinar, and then at the very end, we'll have a feedback form for you to complete, and it is the feedback form that we will use to issue our recertification credit. So make sure you stay to the end and complete that form if you would like that credit. I would love to know who we have with us today. So if in the chat you want to tell me your name and your district, maybe what's your position, just to say good morning. Let's see who we have with us. Hi, Linda. Spartanburg 1. Hey, Christy. Kimberly. We got Barnwell, Anderson 4, Oconee.
Go.
Good morning. Good morning, Charleston. Public charter school. A lot of Charleston folks this morning. Good. Fairfield. Hi, Karen. Fairfield is where my children are enrolled in school, so it's always good to see a Fairfield friend. Aiken County, that's where I grew up. Very good. All right, I see we've got people from all over. So I appreciate you being here and spending an hour with us this Thursday morning. So let's go ahead and get started with a little bit of a consider this. So, let me talk about the purpose first. So our purpose today is to deepen your understanding of AOR 1.2 by exploring indicator intent, effective instructional strategies, and how that aligns with our HQIM across the state. So now we'll start with a little bit of a consider this. All right, everybody probably immediately knows what this text is, right? Chicka chicka boom boom. So just take a moment and you can respond on your note catcher or in the chat. Would you consider this text to be appropriate for instruction to meet kindergarten expectations in general? Why or why not? And do you notice any literary devices? So just really quickly, again, you can pop your thinking in the chat, put it on your note catcher. right? So thinking through chicka chicka boom boom for kindergarten expectations. All right, now I have another consider this. Oh, Julie, thank you. Yes, there's onomatopoeia. Absolutely. There's some rhyming. All right. What about this for second grade? So this is classic Amelia Bedelia. Would this text be appropriate for instruction to meet second grade expectations? Why or why not? Do you notice or see any literary devices? Idioms, yes. Revisiting alliteration, love that. Old Amelia never did understand an idiom. All right, final one, the Lemonade War. And this is a text that is actually in a couple of the HQIM for elementary school. So Lemonade War, would you consider this to be appropriate for instruction to meet third grade expectations? And do you notice or see any literary devices? Yes, we've got onomatopoeia, pop, thwop, pop, thwop. The very first line, a thin spider web of sweat draped itself over his forehead. Um, the bats in his chest were going nuts. So there are some examples there as well. And so I wanted you to look at these three examples because in a few minutes, we're going to look specifically at the indicator expectations for figurative language for kindergarten through third grade. And I want us to think back to these examples as we discuss those expectations and really think about text in our classroom that we can use to help meet those expectations for figurative language. All right, so our agenda for today, we're going to start with understanding AOR 1.2. Then we'll talk about strategies and HQIM alignment, and then we will close it up. So the first thing I want you to do is to take a look at AOR 1.2. This is the vertical articulation, starts with fifth grade at the top and it goes down to kindergarten. So just take a moment to notice what draws your attention, and you can put this in your note catcher, you can pop it in the chat, you can unmute, but what draws your attention? The verbs are changing. All right. Fifth grade is all the way up to analyze. Excellent. There's a gradual progression of adding different forms of figurative language. There are specific examples listed. Absolutely explain the purpose. There is a definite progression of rigor. Absolutely. So that's exactly what I picked out as well. You have your specific examples of figurative language that are included. You got metaphor, hyperbole, similes, personification, idioms, alliteration, onomatopoeia. And if you notice, those words are in bold. If you haven't looked at our vertical articulation document before, whenever there is a bolded word, it means that that concept or skill is introduced for the first time at that grade level. So kindergartners, obviously first year of school, they're hearing alliteration and onomatopoeia for the first time. When you get to second grade, similes, personification, and idioms. When you get to third grade, metaphor and hyperbole are introduced for the first time. So if you think back to our examples of literature, When we had Amelia Bedelia at grade 2, that would be an appropriate text to help introduce idioms, right? Onomatopoeia with chicka chicka boom boom in kindergarten. That's a great text, and alliteration and onomatopoeia to use. So we want to make sure that the text that we're choosing would be ones that meet the expectation of the indicator. Another thing, some other bolded words, we have descriptive phrases, imagery, descriptive words, and rhyme are also skills that are related. And then you guys started picking up on kind of what's after the verb. How does it impact meaning and contribute to the reader's experience? And that, of course, comes in at 4th grade. And finally, the verbiage, which is the first thing you noticed. The skills that we're asking range from in kindergarten where we're identifying, to 1st grade, identify and explain, which goes all the way up through 3rd grade, but that doesn't mean that our rigor isn't changing. We're just adding rigor in other ways. We're adding the different types of figurative language. So identify and explain, the purpose will stay 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, but the forms are changing. And then in 4th grade, we're determine and explain. And then in 5th grade, we get all the way up to analysis. So very good noticing that progression of rigor changes. But one of the most important things is to remember what you are responsible for in each grade level for introducing those bold words. So what is figurative language? So if you haven't looked at our glossary for the standards, we do have a glossary that is written for our standards and aligns with the intent of our indicators. So I have pulled the definition of figurative language from the glossary. It's a language that helps readers interpret a writer's meaning and allows a writer to articulate more abstract and complex concepts in an understandable way. And if you look up the definition in the glossary, it then lists out all the different types of figurative language that are mentioned in the standards and indicators and defines those as well. One piece of feedback that we got often with our new standards is that maybe the skills like alliteration and especially onomatopoeia is a little too difficult for kindergartners. Are you sure that a kindergartner can handle onomatopoeia? Are you sure that alliteration is something that students need to be able to recognize in kindergarten? And so we want to point out that is a skill that actually aligns with Foundations of Literacy 1.2, where we're asking students to recognize alliterative spoken words. So when students are practicing that phonetically, they should then be able to recognize it in a text when they hear it read out loud. So there is some crossover or some connection between AOR and your Foundations of Literacy. If you think about how alliteration is really one of those concepts that feels a little playful, but it really carries a lot of instructional value. They begin to really tune students begin to tune their ears into those repeated initial sounds. And once they can recognize those sounds in isolation, they can begin to identify it when they hear it in a text that's read aloud. This also ties into early learning experiences in general. Think about how often we teach young children animal sounds or rhyming phrases. It's engaging with language through sound. So when we return to alliteration in the primary grades, we're reaching back to those essential early learning skills that we naturally do with students and that they've already mastered. Which is going to eventually allow them to be more effective as they move into more complex reading and writing tasks. Alliteration and onomatopoeia really are accessible entry points for students and kindergartners. They're not too abstract or difficult. They're really just concrete examples of how sound and meaning can work together in language. Another thing is that's the examples of figurative language they're most likely to encounter in grade level text, especially in narrative and poetry selections. Just about every kindergarten, 1st grade book you pick up is going to have alliteration, onomatopoeia, rhyme. right? So by teaching these skills early and explicitly, we're reinforcing foundational literacy skills, but also preparing students to analyze text complexity through qualitative measures. So sound, style, and structure, and how those things affect meaning. I just wanted to draw that connection to kind of preemptively answer that question of, well, is alliteration and onomatopoeia really appropriate for kindergarten? And so then you'll see when you get to grade 2, simile, personification, idiom is introduced, and then grade 3, metaphor and hyperbole. There is not a new introduction of content in first grade, but the skill does increase. If you remember, that verbiage changes from identify to identify and explain. All right, so then we have literary devices. So what's the difference between figurative language, literary devices? These are techniques intentionally used by the author to create a specific effect in a written work. And so we have introduction of literary devices in both kindergarten and first grade. So kindergarten, we introduce descriptive words and rhyme. And then in grade 1, it's descriptive phrases and imagery. So again, you can see that skill increase. We go from just a word to phrase. We have rhyme in kindergarten, and then the imagery in grade 1. Again, this does correlate to a foundations indicator, foundations of literacy 1.3, where we're recognizing and producing pairs of rhyming words and distinguishing them from non-rhyming pairs using pictures and or spoken words. So you can see that crossover and alignment there. Just to give you some additional definitions from our glossary, descriptive details. These are the details related to the 5 senses. So sight, smell, taste, touch, sound. Those are the types of things we'll be looking for when talking about descriptive words and descriptive phrases. Imagery, same thing, very, very similar definition. This is anything that's used to create a mental picture for readers. So again, looking for the 5 senses details when reading. So let's take a closer look at the progression of rigor, or the verbs, as you pointed out. In kindergarten, students are asked to identify. Then we move to identify and explain, and then determine and explain, and analyze. But we often get asked, well, what really is the difference, especially for something like identify and explain or determine and explain? So I wanted to break down what each of these expectations means and give you those definitions. So for identify, we just want students to recognize or name information that's implicit or explicit within a text, or select from a provided list. So tell me, which one's an example of onomatopoeia? Do you see an example of alliteration? We move then in grades 1 through 3 to identify and explain. So not only do we want students to be able to pick out a simile or a metaphor or an idiom, we want them to then be able to explain that idea or concept in detail. Then we move to determine and explain, where the definition for determine is to use information from a text to make an inference. And if you look at the 4th grade indicator, it adds how it impacts meaning and contributes to the reader's experience. So we've really jumped up here in rigor because we want students to, yes, identify, here's the example of figurative language, here's what it means, I'm describing it in detail, but here's how it impacts the text and the way that I read this text and experience this text. And that is the determine piece. And it goes finally to analyze, which is where we're expecting more from the student. This is to explore a text critically by considering key and literary elements and how these elements function individually in a text, as well as how they interconnect. So we may be adding multiple examples of figurative language and how they all work together to shape the way the reader experiences a text. So there is a definite progression of rigor. One thing that I often saw when I was, teaching middle level intervention, and honestly, I often did that I would change, is I didn't always hold students to the grade level expectation. I had intervention students. I wanted them to be successful. I wanted to meet them where they are. And so we did a lot of identifying and maybe some explaining. And we didn't ever move into that determine or analyze stage when we should have. So it's just important to remember what is the rigor expectation for your grade level. So I want to give you some examples of that. So this assignment on the right is intended for grade 1. Does it meet the expectations of AOR 1.2 for grade 1 in the standards? Why or why not? And you can put that in the chat. You can unmute. Yay, Anne. I thought I was going to trick somebody because it does say to explain the meaning, right? But I didn't trick you because uh, hyperbole is not introduced until 3rd grade. So that's too soon. That is not an appropriate assignment or demonstration of understanding for our 1st grade students. All right, let's look at the next one. This assignment is intended for 3rd grade. Does it meet the expectations of AOR 1.2 for grade 3? Why or why not? We're just identifying and not explaining, right? We are not explaining the purpose. Very good. And my final example is for grade 5. Does this meet the expectation? Oh, just identifying again. And so I gave you these 3 examples because what I did is I went to Google and I typed in figurative language assignment for 1st grade and 3rd grade and 5th grade and picked the very first thing that came up. And these were the very first 3 that came up. And I did that because when we as teachers get strapped for time or we just want extra practice or whatever it may be, we often do that. We just Google like, hey, I need this, and we don't read into it too much. We go to Teachers Pay Teachers and we find an assignment. And while it may meet the rigor of some other states' expectations, it's not meeting the rigor of our expectations. So I wanted you to think through what that looks like and to really reflect on what practice assignments, what instructional resources are you using to teach these skills, and do they truly meet the expectation of your grade level indicators? And after reflecting on what's going on in the classroom that you're a part of, take a minute to think about how does this knowledge impact your planning and instruction moving forward. And maybe it's just an affirmation or a confirmation that, yep, I'm making sure that we're meeting the expectations. But maybe it's, I need to take another look at some of the practice examples that I'm giving, or maybe I need to look at my HQIM and make sure that I'm digging in there. But take a second. You can put this in your note catcher or put it in the chat if you're brave. How does this knowledge, the knowledge of indicator expectations, as well as looking at those examples, impact your planning and instruction? Yes, thank you, Allison. So ensuring that we're moving past just identifying that's the gap where we often see teachers. And again, guilty is charged, right? I always have said that if I could go back in the classroom right now, that's the one thing that I would change with my intervention middle school students is that I would expose them more to grade level expectations, right? Absolutely, Megan. And we're going to talk about this in just a minute, but how we look at our materials, whether they're our HQIM or there's something we have just found on the internet or that we've always used to make sure that we're meeting the rigor required at each grade level. Kayla, this is exciting as we just had a PD on DOK. I love that. And levels of questioning. Um, that is wonderful. The standard that's always been a struggle. It's really going to be helpful for teachers concerning the rigor of questioning. Looking at the verbs, making sure we're teaching the appropriate level of skill. Absolutely. Looking carefully at materials that teachers are getting from ChatGPT, other AI sources, be sure they meet our standards. And listen, I love ChatGPT as much as the next girl, right? I love it. I use it all the time. But you're exactly right that just, any resource that we pull or we use needs to be vetted, right? And it needs to be in alignment with our grade level. Excellent. All right. So now that we all have that basic understanding, we've taken a look at the grade level expectations for this indicator. Let's look at some strategies. This is always most people's favorite part because you get to look at some things that have already been developed that you can potentially use in your classroom. So I'm going to put a folder in your in the chat, and I think it's linked on your note catcher as well, but it's a strategy folder. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to do the USA strategy where just look through them. What strategies can you use as is? What strategies could you share with a colleague? And what strategies could you use, but you might need to adapt them first? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes or so to peruse the strategies that have been included and see what you could use, share, or adapt.
That needs to grab some artifacts. Copy that.
Okay, Felicia, give me a second to download these as PDFs for you, okay? And Casey, can you put the note catcher back in the... Felicia, will you put your email in the chat for me, or you can private chat it to me and then I will send these over to you. Thank you. All right, they are going to be on their way in just a second. All right. So in the chat, if you will share one of the grade level strategies that you feel like you could use at another and you thought, oh, I could probably adapt this or share this with a colleague. Second grade matching activity. Absolutely, April, share with everyone. The first grade sentence stems, absolutely. Figurative language detective for third grade. And again, I think some of the follow-up questions, the reflection questions, the way that you're getting students to maybe explain or write their thinking down is really what's going to push it to the rigor of that intended grade level. So hopefully there's some strategies in there that you can use, you can share, you can adapt. Yes, I love the explanation sentence frames, giving students that kind of framework for the language that they can use to share what they're thinking. It's very helpful. So good. I'm glad that you found something you could work with. Now, I do want to make sure that I spend a little bit of time talking about your high quality instructional materials, and how we can take strategies like the ones from that folder and supplement our HQIM if needed with those strategies. I have picked just Into Reading as my example for this. I know not everyone uses Into Reading. If you want to put in the chat, what is your curriculum that you have adopted in your district, so we can see where everyone kind of lies. And then know that the process that I'm about to show you can be used with any curriculum. So whether you have Wonders, HMH, whether you have CKLA, whatever it may be, you can use this same process. All right. So this is an example of a figurative language lesson / activity from Into Reading, grade 3, volume 1, week 2, lesson 7. So if you happen to have Into Reading and you're a 3rd grade teacher, this is an example for you. But the first thing that I want you to notice is that most of our HQIM are going to provide some sort of instructional vocabulary list, right, with definitions. And so I always want to encourage you first to make sure that the definitions that your HQIM have supplied align with the definitions in the standards glossary. With figurative language, that's not going to matter quite as much because a simile is a simile, a hyperbole is a hyperbole, right? But when you get to other concepts, for example, is your HQIM using main idea instead of central idea? That's a big one because our standards use central idea. So making sure that any instructional vocabulary that you and your students have access to is in alignment with the standards glossary, so that we know that students are receiving definitions that are in line with the intent of the indicator. The second thing I want you to do is take a look at whatever the learning objectives are for that lesson. And again, we're specifically focused on AOR 1.2 for this particular lesson, but you can use this strategy or this protocol for any of your standards. This particular one, if we just kind of summarize what the learning objectives are, students are asked to describe an author's use of figurative language, explain the meaning of similes, idioms, and onomatopoeia, demonstrate an understanding of the text through writing, and then articulate the meaning of an idiom using a real life example. So that is what we would expect our 3rd grade students to get out of this particular lesson. Now, the next step would then be to take a look at the indicator expectation for 3rd grade. Because if we don't know what the indicator expectation is, then we're not going to be able to see if those lesson objectives are in alignment. And so for grade 3, identify and explain the purpose of forms of figurative language to include metaphor, hyperbole, and idioms. So if we break that into our skills and content, we know that we're identifying forms of figurative language, specifically metaphor, hyperbole, and idiom. We're explaining the purpose of forms of figurative language. And those are really the 2 big skills and content that we're asking: identify and explain metaphor, hyperbole, and idiom. So let's then look at that next to the objectives for the lesson. On the top, I have those 4 lesson objectives. On the bottom, I have the skills and content. Let's see where they align and overlap. First, we're asking for the author's use of figurative language. You can see down in the indicator the purpose of forms of figurative language. We see explain the meaning of idioms in the lesson objective, and that aligns with explaining an idiom in the indicators. But my question is, what does this alignment tell us? So you see where the lesson objectives line up, and you see where the indicators, or where they line up with the indicators. What does that tell us? about this lesson? It's not a complete match to the indicators, right? What are we missing? We haven't addressed metaphor. We haven't addressed hyperbole. All right. And that's a good point. She said it might be hard for students since they're not identifying first. It's a good point because metaphor and hyperbole and idiom, this is the first introduction they've had to this, right? What does the lesson include that might not be necessary for third grade? Emily's an onomatopoeia, right? So exactly. The lesson doesn't meet the full extent of the indicator expectations. We're missing metaphor. We're missing hyperbole. We know this is their first introduction to those skills, so we've got to put in some identification somewhere. I love how Julie said, so we need to make sure that we're hitting that in other lessons, or either we supplement and work it in, right? But we also know that similes are introduced in grade 2 and onomatopoeia is introduced in kindergarten. So depending on what the lesson actually looks like, this might be mostly a review lesson. And that doesn't mean we throw it out. What if we used it in a small group situation in tier 2 instruction for those students who need it, right? They need that review. So we've kind of looked at the alignment. What do we do now? The first thing we want to do is actually look at the pages of the lesson. Because oftentimes the learning objectives that are listed don't give us the best understanding of what the lesson actually looks like. So I went through and looked at the lesson and the resources that were attached with this particular lesson. It includes anchor charts with definitions for onomatopoeia, alliteration, personification, imagery, metaphor, simile, hyperbole, and idiom. So even though the learning objectives did not include hyperbole or metaphor, the resources did include those definitions. The know it, show it activity, so the way that students demonstrate their understanding in this lesson, only includes onomatopoeia, simile, and idiom. But it does ask students to explain the meaning of examples from text. So it really is only a partial connection. It's a great review for onomatopoeia, simile, maybe a great introduction for idioms, but we would absolutely have to supplement for metaphor and hyperbole. And so that's what we would do. We now can think through, how do I need to adjust this lesson? I can teach idioms with it. I can review onomatopoeia and simile, but I will need to supplement the lesson to fully meet indicator expectations. And that's where activities like the strategies from the strategy folder can come into play. We can pull those and use them as supplement to this. Maybe we use that activity or that strategy as our tier 1 whole class instruction for the day. And then we use our HQIM as a follow-up for tier 2 students, or we just pull the idiom examples, or we use the HQIM and we add in metaphor and hyperbole examples. Or we just leave it as an idiom and then we do a whole nother lesson that does metaphor and hyperbole. Whichever way we work it, because you've gone through this process of looking at the lesson, looking at the indicators, and seeing that overlap, you can very clearly identify what students will still need to be successful in understanding the full intent of that indicator. So my question for you now is, how will that process of breaking down the indicator expectation and the lesson objectives impact your planning and instruction? And you can think past AOR 1.2 because that is a process that can be used with any indicator. So take a moment in the chat and consider how that process impacts your planning and instruction, or how it has you thinking differently now. Excellent, April. Being intentional of turning to our indicators, right? When we're planning their HQIM. Absolutely. Have a clear understanding of the HQIM and knowing, can I use the lesson as is or possibly in a different manner or with a different group of students? Do I need to supplement? Must be aware of indicator expectations. We want to make sure that we are familiar with all of our resources. And I love that idea of training teachers to go through the process, considering it part of that unit internalization process or lesson internalization process where we don't just pick up our HQIM and say, yep, I'm good for the day. I'm just going to follow the book, right? That we really understand what we're teaching and what those resources have. Julie, great point of considering how the vocabulary in our HQIM align with our state definitions, making sure that our language stays consistent with students, knowing our grade level indicators. Absolutely. So hopefully that is a process that you can replicate. Is it realistic to think that we could do that with every single lesson in our HQIM? Probably not all in 1 year, right? So, start with one indicator. Look at your data. Look at what students historically have struggled with, or maybe there's a brand new indicator in your grade level. If you're not sure which ones are brand new for your grade level, we have some excellent resources called the top 10 documents for each grade band that kind of outline what we felt were the top 10 shifts that you needed to know for the standards in each grade level. And start there. Say, you know what, this year, let's focus on these 3 indicators. And anytime in our HQIM we see that pop up, let's make sure that that lesson truly aligns. Let's go through this process where we take the objectives, we take the indicators, and we figure out where we can supplement with some additional resources if needed. And then I love how this last comment says better alignment of assessment and instruction. You've included that assessment piece. Because again, if our HQIM has changed, if our lessons have changed, if our standards and indicators have changed, that means our assessments need to change as well. We can't continue to use the same assessments we've always used because they are no longer relevant to the standards, indicators, and curriculum that we have. So I love that you're thinking through the idea that those assessments are going to need adjustments as well. All right, so that brings us to clarity and closure. For today, again, was to deepen your understanding of AOR 1.2, looking at indicator intent, looking at some instructional strategies and how we can align that to our HQIM. And so our final reflection, mirror microscope binoculars. What misconceptions have been clarified or new learning was experienced? What do you still need to take a closer look at? And how will the information from today's session impact student learning? And so the last thing I want you to do in the chat is to pick one of these, either mirror, microscope, or binoculars, and tell us your next step. What are you thinking? What have you learned? What are you going to do next?